Somewhere in the galaxy, in a region of space so vast it rivals the breadth of Ultramar itself, two forces that should never have met are locked in a war, so immense, so ferocious, so completely without mercy, that it has remade entire solar systems into killing fields. There are no civilians here. There are no negotiations. There are no ceasefires, and no retreats that mean anything except the temporary gathering of breath before the next wave. There is only the grinding, relentless, bone-deep violence of two species that were quite literally made to destroy. One side grows stronger the more it fights. The other grows stronger the more it feeds. And the Imperium of Man, with breathtaking arrogance and desperate ingenuity, looked at these two apocalyptic forces, looked at each other, and decided the best course of action was to introduce them. This is the story of the Octarius War, and it is one of the most fascinating, most horrifying, most perfectly Warhammer 40,000 stories ever written into the lore of this universe. It is a story about a plan that worked and a plan that catastrophically, completely failed somehow at the same time. It is a story about what happens when two species that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be stopped, and cannot be destroyed are thrown into the same corner of the galaxy and told, by no one, to fight it out. And it is a story that is still not over. Think about that for a moment. Not a battle, not a campaign, a war. A sustained multi-system, multi-decade conflict between the two species in the entire setting that we're perhaps least capable of stopping because neither of them has a concept of stopping. We are not talking about two human factions who might eventually exhaust their resources or run out of will or decide a political settlement serves their interests better than continued bloodshed. We are talking about a species whose entire biology is oriented toward generating and sustaining violence, fighting a species whose entire biology is oriented toward consuming everything it encounters. There is no off switch. There is no summit or ceasefire or negotiating table. There is only the war and more war, across dozens of worlds and decades of time, and underneath it all, the barely acknowledged truth that someone lit the fuse, and that person was human. Settle in. This one goes deep, and it deserves to. Part 1. The Two Unstoppable Forces. To understand why the Octarius War matters, you first have to understand what the two sides actually are. Not just at a surface level, not just as factions you put on a table, but what they truly represent within the fiction of this universe. Because when you understand both of them properly, the full horror of what happened in Octarius becomes clear in a way it cannot be if you treat either side as just another army. Start with the Orks. Orks are not simply aggressive aliens. They are not just green-skinned brutes who love fighting. That reading, while not entirely wrong, is a simplified caricature of something far stranger and far more dangerous. Orks are a species that was engineered. They were created, most lore scholars believe, by ancient beings called the Old Ones, forged as a biological weapon at the very dawn of the current galactic age. They were built from the ground up to be warriors, and everything about their physiology reflects that origin. Their bodies are practically armored already. They regenerate from wounds that would kill a human outright. They can survive in hard vacuum for a short time. They can breathe an astonishing variety of atmospheric compositions. A severed hand, under the right conditions, might grow a new orc. Decapitation, in some documented cases, has not been sufficient to kill them quickly. But the truly alien thing about orcs, the thing that sets them apart from almost every other species in the setting, is their reproduction. Orcs don't have children. They don't mate. They don't carry young. They reproduce through spores, microscopic biological packages that they continuously release into any environment they occupy. These spores spread through soil, through water, through the very air, and over time they germinate into squigs, snotlings, Gretchen, and eventually full orcs. An orc world, once infested, almost cannot be cleansed. You can kill every orc on the surface, burn the cities, salt the earth, and decades later the spores that were lying dormant in the rock will bloom into a new generation. The galaxy, at this point, has been saturated with orc spores across tens of thousands of years of constant expansion. Some Imperial scholars have quietly, horrifyingly suggested that orc spores might already exist on almost every inhabited world in the Milky Way, simply waiting for conditions to be right. Orcs grow larger with age, and more importantly, they grow larger through conflict. An orc who fights constantly, who wins and keeps winning, who leads other orcs in conquest after conquest, will physically swell in size. The biggest orcs in existence are the war bosses and the legendary warlords creatures that stand 3 meters or more, armored in muscle and attitude, who can trade blows with space marines and come out grinning. These are not outliers. They are the natural result of a species that becomes more powerful the more war it wages. The orcs don't just seek war, they need it biologically. It is as essential to them as food and water. An orc society, at peace, is an oxymoron. They fight each other when there's no one else to fight, and that internal violence simply produces more hardened, angrier, more capable warriors. Now, the orc psyche is infused with something called the Wog field, a collective psychic emanation generated by the mass belief of millions of orcs focused on the concept of war and victory. This field does strange, genuinely impossible things. It makes the crude, ramshackle weapons orcs build function far better than they should by any law of physics. It makes their vehicles faster. It generates an almost electric charge of momentum and enthusiasm that can wash over entire battlefields and drive orcs to feats of violence that defy any rational explanation. And when an orc warlord becomes powerful enough, when enough orcs believe strongly enough in him, this field can call other orcs from light years away, pulling them toward the gathering host, like iron filings toward a magnet. These gatherings are called by many names in the lore, but for the purpose of this script, we'll refer to the mass migration and assault forces that result from this phenomenon as a great Wa. Because that's essentially what they are, the organized fury of an entire species, given a singular direction. An average Great Wog involves anywhere from millions to billions of orcs, spread across dozens of ships, hitting a target world or sector with the force of a biological catastrophe. The largest in recorded history have involved forces so immense they required the combined military might of multiple Space Marine chapters, an entire Astra Militarum battle group, and the support of alien allies just to slow them down. And even then, the orcs inevitably return, because the spores are still there, because survivors scatter and rebuild, because orcdom is not a civilization you can destroy, so much as a tide you can temporarily push back. There is something philosophically interesting about the way orcs exist in relation to the concept of defeat. A human army that is beaten retreats, regroups, considers whether the goals they were fighting for are still achievable at acceptable cost. A Tau force that is defeated will reassess its strategic posture, consider withdrawal to more defensible positions, evaluate political options. The orcs do not have this mental architecture. An orc who is losing a fight simply becomes angrier, which biologically translates into physical performance improvements, which means the fight continues at a higher intensity. You cannot demoralize them in any conventional military sense. You can kill them, but you have to kill all of them, and even then the spores persist. What this means in the context of Octarius is critical. The Imperium's hope that the two species would grind each other down rested on an assumption that both sides would eventually reach a point where continuing was no longer biologically possible. For the Tyranids, that assumption was at least theoretically valid. A hive fleet that consumes too slowly while being destroyed in battle can run out of biomass to replace its losses. For the orcs, the assumption was essentially false. You cannot grind down a species that becomes more capable the more you try to grind it. Now let's talk about the Tyranids. If the orcs are the galaxy's oldest and most enthusiastic fighters, the Tyranids are the galaxy's most perfect predators. They are not from this galaxy. They come from the intergalactic void, from the darkness between galactic clusters, a traveling biological superorganism so vast and so ancient that contemplating its full scale is genuinely challenging to do without feeling small. What enters our galaxy are not the Tyranids themselves in any real sense. They are advanced tendrils of a force so enormous that what has reached us so far might be the barest fringe of its leading edge, the scouts sent ahead while the main body still churns through the void between galaxies. Every Tyranid organism, from the smallest ripper to the largest biotitan, is part of a single unified consciousness called the hive mind. There are no individual Tyranids in the way we understand individuality. There is no Tyranid soldier who wakes up in the morning with his own hopes and fears and plans. Every creature in the swarm is a cell in a single galaxy-spanning body, directed by a central will that experiences time and space very differently than any other species in the setting. The hive mind is not reactive the way humans are reactive. It thinks in evolutionary timescales and strategic geometries that span solar systems. Tyranids consume everything. Every molecule of usable biomass on every world they encounter is stripped away and fed back into the organism, digested and processed and reborn as new bioforms tailored to whatever challenge the swarm has faced. A world that falls to the Tyranids doesn't just lose its civilization. It loses its oceans, its atmosphere, its soil, its microorganisms, its plant life. When the hive fleet is done with a world, what remains is a drained husk of bare rock floating in space. The term the Imperium uses for this is consumption. It is exactly as total and final as it sounds. But the most dangerous thing about the Tyranids is not their numbers or their hunger. It is their adaptability. The hive mind learns from every battle, every defeat, every unexpected strategy its enemies deploy. It incorporates that learning directly into the genetic code of new organisms. Fight a Tyranid swarm today and kill it using sonic weaponry, and the next wave that arrives may well have organisms specifically bioengineered to be deaf to sonic disruption. Use chemical weapons against them, and the following generation of Tyranid creatures will have acid-resistant carapace. Every trick you have, every weapon you use, every clever tactic your generals devise, the Tyranids catalog it, analyze it, adapt to it, and return it to you as an evolutionary counter. They are, in the most literal possible sense, the universe's most dangerous student. The more you teach them about how you fight, the more dangerous they become. And they have had a very long time to learn. These are the two forces at the heart of the Octarius War. An unkillable species defined by biological imperative toward war, and an endlessly adaptive species defined by total consumption. Put them in a room together, and common sense suggests they'll tear each other apart until one side is gone. The Imperium of Man, specifically one particularly desperate and morally unencumbered inquisitor, decided to test that hypothesis. The result was not what anyone expected. Part 2. The Octarius Empire. A green galaxy within a galaxy. Before we can talk about the war itself, we need to understand what the Tyranids were being steered toward. The Ork Empire of Octarius is not just some collection of backwater orc worlds. It is, according to the lore, one of the largest orc empires in the entire galaxy. A sprawling dominion spread across the Octarius sector in the Ultima Segmentum, an expanse of space described as being nearly as large as the realm of Ultramar itself. That comparison is not made casually. Ultramar is a significant political and military territory. Comparing anything to its size is a way of saying that whatever you're describing is genuinely enormous. The world at the heart of this empire is simply called Octarius, or later in the lore, Octaria. This is the seat of power, the central world around which the whole Orc realm is organized, insofar as Orc politics can be said to have organization. The Orc ruler of this empire bears the title the Overfiend of Octarius, and it is a title that carries enormous weight in the context of Orc culture. To be the Overfiend is to have beaten absolutely every other warlord in the sector into submission, to have accumulated so much fighting experience and psychic Wog energy that other Orcs feel compelled to follow you out of a mixture of genuine reverence and simple self-preservation. The Orcs of Octarius don't obey the Overfiend because of laws or treaties or political alliances. They obey because he is, demonstrably, the biggest and the most terrifying. And in Orc culture, that is the only qualification for leadership that counts. At the time Hive Fleet Leviathan arrives, the Overfiend is an Orc warlord named Blacktooth. Blacktooth is a name that doesn't get as much lore attention as some of the other figures in this story, but his position tells us everything about what kind of creature he is. He rules an empire nearly the size of Ultramar. He has survived long enough and won enough consecutive battles to claim the most powerful throne in one of the galaxy's largest Orc nations. He is, by any reasonable measure, a being of frightening physical and psychic power, who has been shaped by decades of constant warfare into something that barely resembles the standard concept of a military leader and functions more like a force of nature wearing green skin. And he is not the only notable figure in the Octarius war story. Before the main events of the conflict, the Overfiend role changed hands several times. A figure called Gorsnik Magash held the title at one point and notably departed the sector to join the fighting on Armageddon during the Third War for that planet, leaving his empire behind, which tells you something interesting about Orc priorities. When Gorsnik left, a Death Skulls warlord named Zog Steeltooth rose to fill the power vacuum. His reign was turbulent, a word that is doing a great deal of work when applied to a society already defined by constant internal violence. The Octarius sector itself is a dense cluster of Orc-held star systems, each one a world of roaring machinery, shouted arguments about which weapons are bigger, sprawling junkyards of salvaged technology, and the kind of constant low-level warfare that keeps an Orc population in fighting shape between major conflicts. Orc worlds are not pleasant places by any standard. The buildings are ramshackle, held together with faith and fungal adhesive. The air smells of oil and burning chemicals. The night is lit by the glow of forges that never stop running. The constant din of grinding metal and enthusiastic shouting never quite fades. But within that chaos, there is a kind of grim vitality, an energy that is uncomfortable to name, but that any soldier who has fought on such a world will recognize. The feeling that everything here is alive, and nothing here is afraid. The Orcs of Octarius, by the time Leviathan arrives, are not soft. They have been fighting each other and any unfortunate passing Imperial vessels for decades, centuries. They have big mechs cranking out weapons that are, by the standards of Orc engineering, genuinely impressive because the WoG field makes them work through a combination of collective belief and barely understood mechanical intuition. They have war machines that would make an Imperial guardsman's jaw fall open and an Astra Militarum tank commander break out in a cold sweat. They have numbers that make any kind of precise accounting essentially meaningless. The Octarius Empire is a place where billions of Orcs live and breathe and fight and multiply, where the spores in the soil are so dense that new Orcs emerge almost continuously without any deliberate cultivation, where the entire ecosystem has been remolded over centuries to produce and sustain what the Orcs need. More Orcs, more weapons, more war. This is the terrain that Hive Fleet Leviathan is being aimed at, not a scattering of undefended worlds, not a region of space with a thin military presence, but the largest Orc empire in the galaxy, absolutely stuffed with some of the most capable and ferocious fighters that any species has ever produced. When Inquisitor Kryptman pointed the Tyranids at Octarius, he wasn't pointing them at a soft target. He was pointing them at the single most concentrated source of violent opposition in this entire region of space. That was, depending on your perspective, either the most brilliant or the most catastrophically wrong-headed part of the plan. The Orc Empire of Octarius had something else going for it that made it a particularly complex stage for the coming war. It had variety. Orc society is divided into clans called clans, each with its own culture, specialties, and fighting style. The Goths, the largest clan, are defined by their love of direct, overwhelming, close-quarters violence. They are the heaviest, most muscular Orcs who paint themselves black and charge into battle screaming. The Evil Sons are speed obsessives, constantly modifying their vehicles to go faster on the principle that speed is a weapon in its own right. The Bad Moons are extraordinarily wealthy by Orc standards because their teeth, which serve as Orc currency, grow fastest, giving them access to better weapons and more elaborate gear. The Blood Axes are the strangest of all, an Orc clan that has had more contact with humanity than most, and that has borrowed human concepts like camouflage, tactics, and strategic retreat, a practice so alien to most Orcs that Blood Axes are viewed with deep suspicion by their kin. The Death Skulls are compulsive looters who strip battlefields of anything useful and repurpose it. The Snakebites are traditionalists who reject heavy technology and rely on monstrous riding beasts and more primal weapons. A sector controlled by Orcs is never monolithic. It is a layered hierarchy of clans, subgroups, warbands, and individual war bosses, all subordinate to the Overfiend, but deeply involved in their own local rivalries and ambitions. This internal dynamism is both a strength and a weakness. An Orc empire is not easy to decapitate because it doesn't really have a single head remove one Overfiend and another will rise within weeks or months, usually after a period of intense internal fighting that paradoxically makes the survivors even stronger. But it can also be exploited, because any external threat that kills a local war boss before the surrounding Orcs have consolidated will find the remaining Orcs collapse into infighting rather than maintaining a unified defense. This is a lesson the Tyranids would learn and eventually use. The final thing worth understanding about the Octarius Empire before the war begins is its strategic position. It sits in the Ultima Segmentum, to the southwest of the Maelstrom, a permanent warp storm of enormous size that dominates the galactic core. This position makes Octarius simultaneously difficult for Imperial forces to reinforce and reach, while also placing it directly in the path of a hive fleet approaching from the galactic south. When Leviathan comes sweeping up from beneath the galactic plane, Octarius is not on the periphery of its projected advance. It is squarely, almost perfectly placed, right in the path that the fleet would naturally take if pointed in its direction. Cryptman noticed that too. Part 3. Hive, Fleet, Leviathan. The Great Devourer comes from below. The third and greatest Tyranid hive fleet to assault the Milky Way is a creature of superlatives. Every way you try to measure it, Leviathan is bigger and more dangerous than what came before. Hive Fleet Behemoth, the first, carved a bloody path through the eastern fringe and was broken at great cost in the First Tyrannic War. Hive Fleet Kraken, the second, was smarter. It fragmented into multiple tendrils, striking simultaneously in dozens of places and making coordinated defense nearly impossible. Kraken was broken after an enormous effort in the Second Tyrannic War, but its splinters continue to plague the galaxy to this day, a reminder that the Tyranids cannot be simply defeated and counted as gone. But Leviathan did something neither of those fleets had done. It didn't come from the eastern fringe. It came from below. When Imperial astropaths and strategists began piecing together the picture of what was happening in 997 of the 41st millennium, the horror they felt was not just at the scale of what they were seeing, but at the direction. Leviathan had skirted the galactic rim entirely, moving around and beneath the plane of the galaxy, approaching from a direction where Imperial defenses were thin and the warning time was minimal. It struck upward through the galactic plane like something surfacing from the deep, and it did so across a front so broad that covering it all was genuinely impossible. It attacked from two widely spaced points simultaneously, like a pair of jaws closing, each tendril targeting different areas of the galaxy and creating a defensive nightmare that no single admiral or general could solve. Leviathan covered the Ultima Segmentum, the Segmentum Tempestus, and pushed fingers of bioships even into the Segmentum Solar. Its appetite was not regional. It was galactic. The ships that make up a Tyranid fleet are not ships in the way the Imperium means when it uses that word. They are organisms, enormous living biological constructs shaped over evolutionary time to function in the void, to project devastating biological weaponry, to carry and deliver their cargo of living weapons, and to sustain themselves by filtering the nutrients present in space and harvesting the organic material of worlds they descend on. A hive ship, the largest category, can be several kilometers in length, and there is no consistent upper limit in the lore to how big one can grow. They communicate not through Vox signals or electromagnetic radiation, but through psychic emanations from the hive mind itself, a form of coordination that cannot be intercepted or jammed by conventional means, and that operates at a speed human science doesn't have a framework to measure. The coordinating signal they generate is called the shadow in the warp, and its effects extend far beyond simple communication jamming. It is a psychic weight, a pressure on the minds of every sensitive being in a region that a hive fleet approaches. It silences astropathic communication, the psychic message service the Imperium depends on for coordination across interstellar distances. It disrupts warp travel by making the already treacherous immaterium even more unstable. And it does something to the minds of ordinary people that is harder to define, but no less real. A creeping unease, an inability to sleep properly, dreams that feel too literal, the persistent sensation that something vast and cold is thinking about you from a direction you cannot identify. Planets under the shadow of a hive fleet see their populations deteriorate psychologically weeks or months before the first bioship appears in the sky. What Leviathan brought with it was not just numbers, though the numbers were staggering. It brought new bioforms. Evolution, for the hive mind, is not a slow generational process. It is a deliberate design function. When the hive mind needs a new kind of organism for a new kind of problem, it simply engineers one, grows it in the Norn queens aboard the hive ships, and deploys it. Leviathan, emerging from the intergalactic void with access to genetic material from unknown species and ecosystems that exist beyond our galaxy's borders, had bioforms that Imperial scholars had never documented. Things that tunneled up through solid bedrock to emerge beneath fortified positions. Things that flew through the shadow of planetary gravity wells and survived atmospheric re-entry without any protection. Things that seemed specifically designed to counter the technology the Imperium had developed against the previous two fleets. The hive mind had been paying attention. Leviathan was the response. Central to Leviathan's command structure, insofar as a single consciousness needs a command structure, was the Swarm Lord. The Swarm Lord is not an individual in any meaningful sense. It is more like a specialized organ, a concentrated focus of the hive mind's intelligence given physical form, capable of directing swarm tactics with a precision and adaptability that even the most gifted enemy commanders cannot match. Unlike most Tyranid organisms, which are expendable and replaced without any loss of institutional knowledge, the Swarm Lord represents something different, a persistent, accumulated strategic intelligence that is reborn in each new host body with all the experience of its previous incarnations. Kill it, and it will simply emerge again from a Norn queen, remembering everything it learned from its death, correcting whatever mistake got it killed, and returning to the battlefield improved. This is the thing leading the Tyranid assault in Octarius. Not a general, not a warlord, a specialized weapon built from galactic-scale intelligence given physical form, carrying memories of tactical situations that span millennia of interstellar warfare. The Swarm Lord's physical form is itself worth describing, because understanding what it looks like helps you understand what it represents. It is enormous by the standards of most Tyranid organisms, not a biotitan, not one of the lumbering planet-cracking beasts, but a creature built for personal combat at the highest possible level. It carries 4 arms, each one ending in weapons of extraordinary biological engineering, the bone sabers, pairs of blade-like protrusions made from an organic material harder than most ceramite. It moves with the predatory precision of something that has spent every incarnation of its existence learning how to kill other creatures that have trained their entire lives to be impossible to kill. It thinks through the hive mind's collective intelligence, which means it has access in real time to every piece of tactical data that any Tyranid organism anywhere in the sector has perceived. It fights with the calculated patience of something that knows it cannot permanently die and therefore has no reason to rush, combined with the absolute commitment of something that has no concept of hesitation. Against most opponents, in most contexts, it is close to unstoppable. The Overfiend of Octarius would kill it once, and in doing so, would tell the Swarm Lord exactly how to win the next time. Inquisitor Cryptman was the first to identify the signs of Leviathan's approach. He recognized the shadow falling over astropathic communication, the strange silence that precedes a Tyranid invasion, what's called the shadow in the warp, a psychic static generated by the mass of the swarm that disrupts warp travel and psychic communication across a wide radius. He recognized the patterns in the reports coming from worlds at the fleet's advance edge. First, mysterious disappearances, then ecological disruption, then contact with Genestealer vanguard organisms that had been traveling ahead of the main fleet for years or even decades, seeding worlds with infestations before the hive ships ever arrived. Cryptman had been dealing with Tyranids longer than almost any living human, and what he recognized, looking at the data coming in from Leviathan's advance, was that this time was different. The scale was different, the direction was different, and the apparent target, extrapolating the fleet's course, was not just another world or another sector. The projected path, if unimpeded, would take Hive Fleet Leviathan deep into the Segmentum Solar, toward Holy Terra itself. He needed a plan. He needed something that could slow a biological force of this magnitude. He had exhausted the conventional options already, and the cost of those options had been devastating. What he had left was an idea, a terrible, brilliant, morally catastrophic idea. Part 4. The Architect of Catastrophe, Inquisitor Kryptman's Gamble. Fidus Kryptman is one of the most interesting and controversial figures in the entire Warhammer 40,000 lore. Not because he is unusually evil by the standards of the Inquisition, which operates in a moral universe where the ends perpetually justify the means, but because what he did worked and failed at the same time, in a way that has left his legacy genuinely difficult to judge. He is the man who gave the Tyranids their name. He is the man who first warned the Imperium about Hive Fleet Behemoth and helped save Ultramar by alerting Marneus Calgar in time to prepare. He is, in the truest sense, the Imperium's foremost expert on the Tyranid menace, a man who has dedicated his entire long career to understanding the creatures that came from beyond the galactic rim to devour everything. He is also the man who, when faced with the largest and most dangerous Tyranid fleet ever encountered, responded by making a decision that the Inquisition itself ultimately judged to be unsanctioned, immoral, and deeply dangerous. They stripped him of his rank. They issued a carta extremis against him, essentially a declaration that he was persona non grata, that his authority was revoked, and that his methods had crossed a line even the Inquisition's expansive ethical framework could not accommodate. Before we get to the Octarius plan, it's worth understanding what Kryptman had already done to earn that reaction. As Hive Fleet Leviathan swept through the southern approaches of the galaxy, Kryptman implemented what he called the Kryptman line. The logic was brutal and simple. Tyranids need biomass to sustain their advance. Their fleet does not carry infinite resources. It needs to consume the worlds it encounters to generate new organisms, new ships, new energy. If you could deny a Tyranid fleet the biomass it needs along its projected path, you could theoretically slow it down, weaken it, force it to divert towards sources of biomass elsewhere. The Kryptman line was a series of worlds cleared of all life to create a cordon of dead systems in the fleet's path. How do you clear a world of all life in the Warhammer 40,000 universe? You use exterminatus. You drop biological or atmospheric weapons of mass destruction from orbit, and you kill everything on the surface. Every person, every animal, every microorganism, every crop, every tree, every ocean creature. You sterilize entire worlds to turn them into biomass-free zones that the Tyranids would have no reason to pause at. Kryptman ordered this done to dozens of worlds. He killed populations numbering in the hundreds of millions, perhaps billions, as a military strategy. The Inquisition, which has historically been willing to authorize exterminatus in extreme circumstances, looked at what Kryptman was doing and decided it had gone too far. The scale was too large. The strategic value was questionable, and the populations being killed were, technically, still loyal citizens of the Imperium rather than planets already lost. Kryptman was declared a radical and stripped of his rank. It didn't stop him. Without his official authority, but still in possession of loyal Deathwatch Space Marines and his own considerable resources, Kryptman continued to operate, and it was during this period of watching the Kryptman line hold partially but not completely, of watching Leviathan adapt and push around the dead zones, that he began developing a different approach. He had observed something during the campaign. Worlds where Tyranids and Orks met were characterized by a peculiar dynamic. Neither side was inclined toward strategic withdrawals. Neither side showed mercy. And critically, when they fought, both sides seemed to sustain enormous casualties, but neither side collapsed. They simply continued fighting with whatever was left, generating more casualties, and the cycle perpetuated itself. An Ork war and a Tyranid invasion, when they met, did not resolve quickly. They ground against each other, and ground, and ground. If he could put Leviathan into that kind of attrition cycle against a sufficiently large Ork force, the fleet would be consumed, not by military defeat, but by the sheer metabolic cost of fighting a war that never ended against an enemy that kept regenerating. The Ork spores would keep producing new fighters. The Tyranids would keep killing them. The Tyranids would lose organisms faster than they could consume biomass to replace them. Eventually, theoretically, the fleet would be exhausted and unable to continue. The Octarius Empire was the obvious target. It was large enough to sustain the war. It was directly in Leviathan's potential path. It was, by definition, absolutely packed with the kind of violence-oriented biomass that a hive fleet would want to consume. All Kryptman needed was to make sure Leviathan actually turned toward Octarius instead of continuing on its current course. It's worth pausing here to try to understand what Kryptman must have been experiencing in this period. He was a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the Imperium from the Tyranid threat, who had watched hive fleet after hive fleet arrive and consume and be turned back at extraordinary cost. He had spent years on campaigns that required him to issue orders that killed billions, not because he wanted to, but because the arithmetic of survival in this universe sometimes produces those calculations as the only viable answer. He was disgraced. He was operating without the support of the institution he had served his entire career. He had no army, no fleet, no authority. He had a small band of Deathwatch warriors who had chosen personal loyalty over institutional obedience, and he had a plan that he knew was morally monstrous by any conventional standard. But he also had a specific knowledge that made the plan, from his particular perspective, less monstrous than the alternative. He knew what Hive Fleet Leviathan was. He had seen what it had done to world after world in its advance. He had extrapolated its course, and he understood, with the cold clarity that comes from decades of dealing with threats that most humans never even learn exist, that if Leviathan continued toward the galactic core unimpeded, the casualty count of the worlds it consumed would eventually include numbers too large to meaningfully describe. Against that scale of potential loss, steering the fleet toward the Orks, who were, by any inquisitorial assessment, an ongoing existential threat in their own right, was a calculation that produced, if not a good answer, at least the least catastrophic answer available. This is the 40,000 universe, at its most honest. Situations where every option is terrible, and the question is not which choice is good, but which choice produces suffering that can be survived, and which produces suffering that cannot. Kryptman chose. And as always in this universe, the choice had consequences far beyond what any single person could have controlled. To do that, he needed bait. The most reliable lure for a Tyranid fleet is the psychic signal of Genestealer infestation. Genestealers are vanguard organisms, the advanced scouts that precede a hive fleet, that embed themselves in a population, reproduce through a complex hybridization process, and slowly convert the local society into a cult devoted to worshiping and awaiting the arrival of the hive fleet. As they do, they generate a powerful psychic beacon that calls to the fleet, guiding it toward the infected world. This psychic signal is detectable across enormous distances by the hive mind. Kryptman's plan was to artificially create such a signal inside the Octarius Empire. To do it, he needed live Genestealers, not dead ones, not samples. Live, active, fully functional Genestealer organisms that would wake up and begin doing what Genestealers do, spreading, infesting, and broadcasting their psychic beacon. Getting live Genestealers was not a simple task. Kryptman led his Deathwatch teams personally into the deep cave systems of a world called Carpathia, where a Genestealer brood was known to exist. The mission was expensive in lives. The Deathwatch are among the finest warriors humanity produces, and even they took heavy casualties, extracting the creatures alive in stasis fields. But they succeeded. They had their Genestealers. The next step was delivery. A space hulk, one of those vast, dangerous conglomerations of fused starships that drift through the warp and emerge unpredictably into real space, called Perdition's Flame, was identified, emerging from the warp near the edge of Ork territory. Space hulks are irresistible to Orks. They are enormous collections of salvageable technology and potential weaponry, and any self-respecting Ork looter will board one the moment it appears. Kryptman's team placed the sleeping Genestealer brood aboard the Perdition's Flame. Then, to ensure it was directed toward Octarius, he destroyed the moon of Geist in a precisely calculated explosion that altered the Hulk's trajectory, sending it on a course directly into the heart of Ork territory. The Orks, predictably, boarded it. The Genestealers woke up. Within the close quarters of a space hulk, In corridors packed with Ork lutas who didn't understand what they were dealing with, the Genestealer brood moved with the patient, lethal efficiency that makes them such perfect vanguard organisms. The Orks who survived the initial ambush went back to their worlds carrying the genetic imprint of the infestation. The cult spread. The beacon was lit. The Blood Axes, to their credit, recognized something was wrong and called in Boss Zagstruck and his Vulture squad to deal with the infestation. They were successful, they contained, and apparently eliminated the Genestealer cult. But the damage was done. The beacon had been broadcasting long enough. A tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan, already probing through the Ultima Segmentum, detected the psychic signal from the infested worlds and changed course. It turned toward Octarius. Cryptman had succeeded. The Hive Fleet was diverted. The worlds of the Imperium, along its original projected path, got something they could not have hoped for: time. Time to build defenses, time to reinforce, time that would have cost billions of lives to buy any other way. And in turning toward Octarius, Leviathan was heading directly into what Cryptman believed was the perfect killing field. What happened next was not precisely what he planned. The Inquisition, when they finally assessed what Cryptman had done, left a record that described the outcome as leaving the Ordo Xenos with, and this is a direct paraphrase, an unholy mess to clean up well into the 42nd millennium. That phrase, so understated in the face of what the Octarius War became, says everything about how completely the situation evolved beyond anyone's ability to control. Before you continue reading, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. There's something incredible about knowing this is reaching someone in a completely different part of the world right now. And if you want more stories like this one, going deep into the lore that makes this universe so endlessly fascinating, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Part 5. First Blood. Orok, Gorala, and the opening clashes. When Hive Fleet Leviathan's leading tendrils entered the Octarius sector, they did not arrive quietly. Nothing about a Tyranid invasion is quiet. The Hive Mind's approach is preceded by a deepening psychic shadow that blankets the entire region in a kind of spiritual static, disrupting communication, agitating animals, filling sensitive beings with creeping dread and formless anxiety. Ork Weird Boys, the Greenskins' version of psychically sensitive individuals, who channel the accumulated Wog energy of their kin, reported strange visions and heard alien thoughts intruding on the familiar, green-tinged mental landscape of Ork psychic life. Something vast and cold was thinking nearby, something that didn't think in words at all. The first major world to receive the invasion was Orok. Orok had been an imperial world before the Orks claimed it, though that distinction had long ceased to have any practical meaning. By the time the war begins, it is a heavily orkified planet, its original architecture buried under decades of ramshackle Ork construction, its soil thick with spores, its population numbering in the hundreds of millions of greenskins at various sizes and stages of development. The Orks of Orok were not, by any measure, unprepared for war. They were Orks. Preparation for war is simply called living. But when the skies of Orok darkened with incoming mycetic spores, the biological deployment pods the Tyranids used to seed a world, vast numbers of them burning down through the atmosphere like a biological meteor shower, the Orks initially responded not with coordinated military action, but with something closer to excitement. They recognized the incoming wave for what it was, a fight, and therefore an opportunity. The shouting and the gunfire that broke out across Orok's defensive positions was not panic. It was enthusiasm. The first contact was devastating for both sides. Lore accounts of the initial fighting on Orok describe a scale of violence that is difficult to hold in the mind all at once. Millions of Ork boys and millions of Tyranid gaunt organisms met on the open plains and tore into each other simultaneously. Squigs Ork riding and attack beasts and rippers, the smallest Tyranid organisms, whose only function is to strip flesh from bone, fought each other underfoot while the larger combatants clashed above them. Ork warbosses and knobs, the veteran elite, crossed weapons with Tyranid warriors and carnifexes. Enormous squigoths, the biggest riding beasts the Orks deploy, crashed into biotitans that matched them for height and exceeded them for killing power. At every scale of the battle, From the microscopic where Tyranid phage cells consume the spores Orks naturally shed to the Titanic, total war consumed the entire world. But the Tyranids had come in numbers that the Orks, for all their enthusiasm, could not simply absorb. The swarm kept coming. The mycetic spores kept falling. The waves of gaunts didn't stop when the first wave was killed. New organisms simply filled the gaps, and the entire mass of the swarm kept pressing, kept grinding, kept consuming. By nightfall of that first terrible day of battle, every Ork on Orok was dead. Their bodies were harvested, stripped of biomass down to the bones, processed through the digestion pools that the Tyranids construct on conquered worlds, and converted into raw biological material for the growing swarm. The first world fell in a single day. The shock of Orok rippled through the sector. Ork warbosses who heard the reports reacted in different ways, but the common thread was that they understood, on some deep instinctual level, that this enemy was different from anything they had faced before. Not worse, necessarily. Orks don't really have a concept of worse when it comes to enemies. More interesting, worthy. This was not a fight you could win by charging harder or yelling louder. This enemy adapted. This enemy didn't fear death. This enemy, in some strange way that violated every Ork instinct about how fights are supposed to work, didn't even seem to experience the battle as something won or lost, but as something processed. The next major engagement was at Gorala, and it told a different story. Gorala was the base of a notorious Ork pirate warboss named Scarfang, who commanded what was collectively called the Scar Fleet, a massive armada of Ork warships assembled through decades of piracy, conquest, and sheer bloody-mindedness. Scarfang was not a strategist in any technical sense, but he was something valuable in space combat, an instinctive naval commander who understood that mobility, aggression, and the judicious use of overwhelming firepower were not three separate approaches, but a single philosophy. He had built the Scar Fleet into a genuine threat to anything that moved through his territory, and he defended Gorala with the comfortable confidence of someone who had never encountered anything he couldn't blow up or outmaneuver. When Leviathan's tendril arrived at Gorala, Scarfang was ready. He scrambled every Ork vessel in a dozen light-years radius and met the bioships in the void around Gorala's asteroid belt. The Orks had seeded that belt with enormous minefields, vast fields of hidden explosives that detonated against the incoming fleet with cataclysmic effect, tearing bioships apart in explosions visible from the planet's surface. The Ork gunships moved through the fire and the chaos, engaging surviving vessels with brutal close-range firepower before they could recover. The Tyranid fleet was, for the first time in this war, effectively destroyed in space, all except one bioship. One vessel broke through the entire Ork defensive cordon. It was damaged, burning along its flanks, bleeding biofluids into the void. But it didn't turn back. It didn't seek to escape. In a display of the hive mind's absolute indifference to individual organism survival, it simply hurled itself at the planet below, launching thousands of mycetic spores from its collapsing body as it fell, seeding Gorala's equatorial plains, even as the ship itself impacted with the force of a natural disaster. Scarfang, watching from orbit, understood immediately that the space battle was over. The real fight was now on the ground. He made planetfall with his boys, and what followed was one of the most well-documented episodes of early Tyranid tactical adaptability in the sector. The Tyranids who landed on Gorala were outnumbered, significantly outnumbered. For perhaps the first and last time in this conflict, the Orks had the numerical advantage in a ground engagement, and the hive mind knew it. The swarm's response was not to simply throw its organisms at the Ork line until they were all dead. That would end in defeat. Instead, the swarm adopted what can only be described as guerrilla tactics. Individual Tyranid organisms stalked and attacked isolated Ork patrols, picking off small groups, avoiding any engagement with a large enough force to overwhelm them. When the Orks responded by grouping up by traveling in mobs large enough that no small Tyranid force could attack them safely, the swarm adapted again. It began engaging in the open, at maximum violence, and then retreating in perfect unison as soon as the Orks were about to overwhelm them. This is the part that should chill anyone reading it. The Tyranids retreated in perfect unison. No individual organism decided to run. No panic spread through their ranks. The hive mind simply decided, as a single intelligence, that the engagement should end, and every organism in the swarm responded to that decision simultaneously. They withdrew to caves and underground spaces, waited through the daylight hours, and when night came, the synapse creatures, the Tyranid organisms that act as nodes in the hive mind's psychic network, maintaining control over the lesser beasts, even at range, gathered the scattered organisms and returned them to the battlefield to feed on the dead. Both Ork and Tyranid bodies were harvested. The biomass went into digestion pools hidden in rocky outcroppings. Slowly, methodically, the swarm built itself back up until it could resume offensive operations. Scarfang was, briefly, having the time of his life. He could see the enemy reforming, adapting, pressing back, and every new tactical challenge they presented made him more energized. He threw himself into the ground war personally, moving from battle to battle across Gorala's surface, and his presence was like an ignition source dropped into a barrel of promethium. Wherever he appeared, Orks rallied. Wherever he pointed, the green-skin tide turned. The Tyranids began losing ground. This moment in the war is worth dwelling on because of what it reveals about the specific dynamic that made Octarius so unusual. In most combat scenarios, when a Tyranid force begins losing ground, the hive mind's response is to pour in reinforcements from orbit, to launch additional mycetic spore drops, to overwhelm the opposition through sheer weight of numbers and fresh organisms. This is a valid strategy when you have the numbers to sustain it. But on Gorala, the initial fleet had been nearly destroyed in the space battle. The Tyranid forces on the ground were genuinely operating with limited reinforcement capacity. They could not simply pile on more bodies. What they could do was think. And the hive mind did something here that Imperial scholars, reading the after-action reports, found genuinely unnerving. It identified the specific individual whose presence was turning the battle. Not the Orks generally, not their tactics or their weapons, the specific Ork called Scarfang, and the specific effect his presence had on the Wa energy of the surrounding forces. It recognized a singular focus of leadership in an opponent not normally known for coherent individual leadership, and it planned around that recognition. Every subsequent tactical decision the swarm made on Gorala was oriented around a single objective that had nothing to do with territory or resource control. Remove Scarfang, and the Ork force would collapse without him. The hive mind noticed. It changed strategy. The swarm began sending feints, waves of hormagaunts, hurling themselves at Ork positions with screaming velocity, only to retreat exactly when the Orks roused themselves to countercharge. The first time it happened, the Orks were confused. The second time, they were irritated. The third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth time, Scarfang began to feel the particular fury of a creature who suspects it is being mocked. On the 10th such feint, when the swarm withdrew again precisely as the Orks rose to fight, Scarfang ordered a full pursuit. Battle wagons and war trucks bellowed forward, engines screaming, boys packed into the back, shouting and waving weapons. Directly into a trap. Broods of venomthropes, organisms that secrete clouds of virulent toxic gas, had been positioned around the escape routes. The pursuing Ork vehicles crashed into rocky outcroppings hidden in the fog, or collided with each other in the chemical murk. The riders began to choke, the toxins finding every gap in Ork armor and every exposed piece of green flesh. As the fog cleared, Scarfang found himself on foot, his vehicle wrecked, his retinue dead or dying around him, and a ring of lictors closing in. Lictors are Tyranid organisms, bred specifically for assassinations, impossibly fast, armed with biological blades and hooks, designed to find the weak points in armor, capable of hiding in plain sight through a natural chameleonic ability that their prey never quite manages to register until it's too late. He killed 2 of them before the rest took him apart. With Scarfang dead, the Ork forces on Gorala did what Ork forces always do when they lose their leader. They collapsed into infighting. The tribes turned on each other, each competing for the position of dominant war boss, and in doing so, they made themselves exactly the isolated, vulnerable targets the Tyranids had been waiting for. The swarm picked them apart one tribe at a time, systematically, until within weeks there was nothing left alive on Gorala's surface. The planet's biomass, Ork, and Tyranid alike was fed into the digestion pools, and the biological material that came out was used to build new Tyranid organisms and new bioships. The fleet that arrived at Gorala grew after consuming it. It would grow larger every time it fed. The infestation spread outward from Gorala to the surrounding Ork worlds. Within weeks, a dozen systems were under assault. The overfiend Blacktooth, receiving reports from every direction, understood that this was not a regional problem or a minor incursion to be dispatched with a punitive expedition. This was a full invasion, the largest invasion the Octarius Empire had ever faced. He began calling the tribes. Part 6. The capital burns. The battle for Octarius. The central world of Octarius was prepared in the way only an Ork world can be prepared for war. Imperfectly, chaotically, enthusiastically, and with a level of sheer committed destructive energy that compensated for any technical deficiencies. When the overfiend Blacktooth received the intelligence that the Tyranid fleet was inbound, he did not attempt a careful defensive posture or a considered military strategy in any human sense of those words. He called the tribes. He called every war boss in range. He called for boys, weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and every piece of military hardware that could be dragged to a firing position in the time available. And then he launched a counter-invasion. This is worth pausing on. Blacktooth, upon learning that a hive fleet of Leviathan's scale was heading toward his capital world, responded by charging at it, not metaphorically. He physically sent his forces into the teeth of the incoming fleet, meeting the Tyranid invasion head-on in the space around Octarius, rather than waiting for it to reach the planet. The Overfiend's philosophy, insofar as it could be called that, was the foundational Ork belief that the appropriate response to a bigger enemy is to hit it first, hit it harder, and keep hitting it until it stops being a problem. A dozen Ork worlds were overrun by the Tyranid advance in the opening weeks of the war. But Blacktooth was not interested in defense. He was interested in the biggest fight of his life, and he had found it. When the first wave of mycetic spores arrived at Octarius itself, the response from the gathered Ork hordes was a sound that the surviving Imperial observers in the sector would later describe as the most terrifying thing they had ever heard. Not screaming, not weapons fire. A cheer. Millions of Orks, waiting on the surface of their capital world as biological pods rained down from the sky, cheered the incoming invasion. Because for an Ork, the arrival of the enemy is not a moment of dread. It is the moment that everything has been leading toward. The moment the fight actually begins. The battle that followed defies easy description. The sheer volume of ammunition fired into the sky by Ork anti-aircraft batteries in the opening hours of the engagement thickened the rain with chunks of falling Tyranid flesh. The biological explosion patterns from destroyed mycetic spores lit up the upper atmosphere like a second sunset, orange and pink and the deep red of Tyranid ichor. The Orks who had managed to get Flakadaka guns and quad guns set up in time were competing with each other for the highest kill counts, arguing at the tops of their lungs about scoring, even as they blew apart incoming organisms. Then the gargoyles came. Winged Tyranid flyer organisms, moving in swarms large enough that from a distance they appeared as storm clouds, dark masses building in from the west and approaching with a sound that began as a low vibration and grew into something between a scream and a roar. Ork Defkoptas and Phytobombers scrambled from their landing pads and raced to intercept. And what happened in the skies above Octarius for the next several hours was an aerial engagement of such ferocity that burning wreckage and dead organisms rained continuously onto the Ork positions below. Burning Ork aircraft, dead gargoyles, the occasional intact Genestealer that had used the aerial chaos to ride a falling piece of wreckage down and was now trying to establish itself in the debris. Underground, the Genestealer broods that had seeded the planet were moving. They had been waiting, patient and hidden, for the signal from the swarm above. When it came, the ground across Octarius split and cracked and disgorged Genestealer broods like living geysers, flooding out of tunnel networks that the insects had been quietly excavating for weeks. The Ork boys on the surface, who found themselves suddenly on top of a tunnel entrance, had approximately no warning before the creatures were on them, and the fighting that erupted in and around those tunnel openings was vicious and close and completely without mercy. But the Orks pushed back. They always pushed back. The responding green tide around every Genestealer emergence was immediate and overwhelming, and the creatures that appeared underground found themselves buried under Ork bodies almost instantly. The Orks plunged into the tunnels after the retreating Genestealers, and what happened in those underground passages is not recorded in detail, but can be inferred from the sounds that witnesses above reported hearing through the ground: continuous impacts, snarling, screaming in multiple registers, and eventually an increased level of general Ork shouting that indicated the engagement underground was going in the Orks' favor. There's something almost beautiful, in a deeply violent way, about the Ork response to underground Tyranid tunnel attacks. The Genestealer is one of the most perfectly designed ambush predators in Warhammer 40,000 fiction. It is fast, it is strong, it has more limbs than expected in more joint configurations than opponents can quickly process, and it emerges from directions that defensive doctrine doesn't normally account for. Against humans, Genestealers in tunnels are catastrophic. They come up through the floor, kill the soldiers who are watching the door, and vanish back underground before a response can be organized. The psychological effect alone is devastating. You can't guard every square meter of ground beneath your feet. The Orks went into the tunnels after them. Rather than posting guards at the openings and attempting to seal the breaches, the Orks simply followed the Genestealers into their own environment and attempted to settle the matter underground. This is not a tactic any professional military establishment would recommend. It is also, apparently, exactly what happened, and by all accounts, the Orks gave a solid accounting of themselves in conditions that should have been overwhelmingly favorable to the Genestealers. Ork sensory biology is different enough from human sensory biology that darkness confers less disadvantage, and Orks underground with their blood up are, if anything, more concentrated and more dangerous than Orks in the open air, because the confines of a tunnel remove most of the options the Tyranids would normally use to avoid direct engagement. Meanwhile, lictors had been working, individually, quietly, each one moving through the chaos of the battle with a patience and a stillness that its environment made possible. There is simply so much happening in a full-scale battle that even an 8-foot alien organism capable of vanishing from visual detection has plenty of cover. The lictors were targeting the Ork anti-aircraft emplacements, specifically the large-caliber guns that were maintaining the most effective fire against incoming spore drops. One by one, silently, each gun emplacement went quiet. One by one, the gun crews died, and no one noticed immediately because there was too much other noise to notice the specific absence of one more gun among hundreds. Once the large guns were down, the rain of mycetic spores doubled, then tripled. The drops came faster, heavier, at angles and in volumes that the reduced air defenses could not adequately address. More Tyranid organisms landed on the mountain passes around the capital. More Orks met them. The fighting on Octarius spread from the initial landing zones to the entirety of the capital's surface within days, and from the capital to the surrounding regions within weeks, and from the planet to the sector within months. The Octarius War had properly begun, and already those watching it from the outside could see something that Kripman had not fully accounted for in his calculations. Both sides were growing stronger. Every Ork who survived a day of fighting against the Tyranids was a harder, more experienced, angrier Ork than the one who had started the day. The kills were piling up. The Wa energy was building. Orks from across the sector and beyond were hearing about the fighting and being pulled toward it by the gravitational force that a sufficiently massive conflict exerts on Ork consciousness. They came not because they were ordered to, but because the fighting was too big, too good, too loud to ignore. They came in ships and on hijacked transports and in ramshackle craft that had no business attempting the journey. They came, and they kept coming, and the Tyranids were consuming. Every dead Ork fed the digestion pools. Every Ork carcass provided new genetic material for the hive mind to analyze and incorporate. The Tyranid organisms were evolving, specifically and deliberately, to counter Ork tactics. Their carapaces were thickening. Their aggression response was intensifying. The creatures the swarm was producing now were measurably faster, measurably more durable, measurably more violent than the organisms that had landed on Orok at the war's beginning. The specific adaptations are worth naming because they illuminate how precisely the hive mind was responding to its opponent. Ork weapons are, by nature, high caliber, high-impact kinetic energy weapons, big projectiles fired fast, or blades of significant mass swung with significant force. The Tyranid carapace adaptations that emerged in Octarius were oriented toward absorbing and dispersing this specific type of damage. Heavier chitin arrangements at the leading body surfaces, denser musculature in the limbs to counter the grappling strength that orcs use in close combat, faster neural response times to compensate for the chaotic, improvised nature of orc tactical behavior, which doesn't follow predictable human military patterns and therefore requires more adaptive, real-time processing from the synapse creatures, managing the swarm's local behavior. The orcs, in parallel, were developing their own counter-adaptations, though in their case, the adaptations happened at the cultural and technological level rather than the biological one. Orc mechs on Octarius were producing new weapon configurations specifically designed around the Tyranid organisms they were fighting. Heavier close-range weapons for dealing with the hardened carapaces, flame-based weaponry to counter Tyranid tunnel networks and close-in swarm tactics, and the shared knowledge base of orc warfare, transmitted not through written doctrine, but through the mimicry and one-upmanship that defines orc culture, spread these adaptations across the sector faster than any formal military instruction program could have. Cryptman had wanted a meat grinder. What he had built was a forge, and both species were coming out of it harder than they went in. Part 7. The Cordon Impenetra. The Imperium tries to contain the impossible. News of what was happening in Octarius reached the Inquisition in fragments. The shadow in the warp, generated by the massive Tyranid presence in the sector, disrupted astropathic communication across the entire region. The WOG energy, generated by millions of orcs in the grip of the most sustained combat experience of their existence, added its own psychic static to the mix. Getting reliable intelligence out of the Octarius war zone was, for most of the war's duration, essentially impossible through normal channels. You sent someone in, you waited. If they came back out, you learned what they'd seen. If they didn't, you drew your own conclusions. What the Imperium could see from the outside was a region of space that had become, in the span of a few years, entirely inaccessible and apparently consuming itself. And what the analysts and tacticians of the Ordo Xenos observed in the data that did emerge was deeply alarming. Not because one side was winning and would shortly be available to threaten the Imperium, but because neither side seemed to be losing. The conflict was escalating, not grinding down, but building up. The orcs were getting bigger, the Tyranids were getting more dangerous. Every engagement that the swarm lost taught it something. Every victory the orcs won made them more capable of winning the next one. The two sides were, in the most literal possible sense, sharpening each other. Someone needed to manage this, and the person who stepped up was not Cryptman, who was by this point disgraced and operating without institutional support, but a different inquisitor entirely. His name was Nashir Sahansun. Sahansun was an older man in the reckoning of the Inquisition, and his path to becoming the primary architect of the Imperium's containment strategy had been unusual. He had originally been known as a brawler, an inquisitor who solved problems with direct physical confrontation and raw force of personality. Wounds sustained in combat against the crude parasitic entities that drain years from the humans they fight near, leaving their opponents aged and withered, had left him unable to fight in the way he once had. Forced by circumstance into a more tactical role, he had discovered that he was, perhaps unexpectedly, very good at it. Sahansun's assessment of the Octarius situation was clear-eyed and unsparing. The conflict could not be ended from the outside. Any attempt by Imperial forces to directly intervene in the fighting would either be insufficient to stop either side or would require committing forces at a scale the Imperium simply did not have available when fighting on a dozen other fronts simultaneously. What he could do was ensure that what was happening inside Octarius stayed inside Octarius. The result was what became known as the Cordon Impenetra. The concept was essentially a spherical perimeter around the entire Octarius war zone, a boundary defined not by physical walls, but by the presence of heavily fortified Imperial worlds and space installations, designed to intercept anything that tried to exit the conflict zone. Worlds on the outer edge of this perimeter were designated Warden planets, given priority resupply, massive garrison increases, and everything the Imperium could manage to ensure they could repel incursions from either direction. Worlds inside the sphere were, with quiet but deliberate finality, effectively abandoned. The cordon impenetra was a line the Imperium drew around a catastrophe and committed itself to holding, and the understanding was that anyone living inside that line was on their own. Imperial specialists, primarily Deathwatch Space Marines, but also elements from several Space Marine chapters, notably the White Panthers and the Silver Templars, and a newer formation called the Celestial Guard, were still going into the war zone on intelligence gathering and sabotage missions. Their job was not to tip the balance toward one side, but to maintain the stalemate. If the Orks were gaining an advantage that might allow them to break through the cordon, those teams would support the Tyranids. If the Tyranids were gaining an advantage, they would support the Orks. The goal was an endless draw, a perpetual war that consumed both forces and neither allowed to escape. Think about what this meant in practice for the Deathwatch teams operating inside the Octarius war zone. The Deathwatch is an organization whose entire culture and purpose is built around hunting alien threats to humanity. These are Space Marines from dozens of different chapters, selected for both their individual excellence and their ability to work across chapter lines, who have dedicated themselves to eliminating Xenos dangers wherever they appear. And here they were, operating inside a war between two of the most prolific alien killers the galaxy had ever produced, with orders to help each side just enough to keep the other from winning. Sometimes that meant providing intelligence that helped Ork forces locate a critical Tyranid synapse creature node. Sometimes it meant identifying an Ork fortification's weak points and passing that information in ways that the Tyranids would eventually receive. Every mission required them to make a judgment call about whether the current balance had shifted enough to justify intervening, and in which direction, and at what cost. The communications problem made this exponentially harder. The shadow in the warp blanketed the entire sector in psychic static. Conventional Vox transmission doesn't work across interstellar distances. Anyway, that's what astropaths are for. But astropathic communication was essentially useless inside the cordon. Runners were dispatched. Physical message carriers, on ships brave or desperate enough to enter and exit the war zone, were the primary means of intelligence transfer for much of the conflict. This meant that the tactical picture available to Sahan Sun and his commanders was always significantly out of date, and decisions about where to deploy limited resources were being made on information that might be months old by the time it arrived. In a war where both sides were adapting and evolving continuously, a month was an enormous amount of time. The Octarius that Sahan Sun's analysts were advising him about was frequently not the Octarius that was actually happening. This was, to put it gently, a strategy that required threading an extremely fine needle across an enormous sector of space while operating with very poor intelligence, against two opponents who were continuously evolving and adapting, and with resources that the rest of the galaxy was also desperately demanding. The cordon held its shape for a while. Then it started showing cracks. The first major breach came in the subsector of Pancalis. The Pancalis breakout, as it became known, was the moment when the containment strategy of the cordon impenetra first visibly failed. Tyranid forces breached the Anilani and Bianzir's hollow systems. Ork warbands pushed through into the Kernak system, and both forces, alongside what appeared to be chaos-influence warp storms, accompanied the breakout in ways that strongly implied external interference, were now fighting on worlds that the cordon was supposed to be protecting. The response scrambled multiple forces. The Dark Krakens, a Space Marine chapter, newly founded during the Indomitus Crusade as part of the massive Primaris reinforcement program, Salamander's successors, who specialized in fighting in darkness and in aquatic environments, named after the bioluminescent ocean predators of their homeworld. Nactus engaged in prolonged delaying actions in the affected systems. Deathwatch kill teams moved into the breach to assess and neutralize where possible. Other chapters were diverted from other duties. The Imperium's stretched military, already fighting the aftermath of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade and managing the fallout of the Great Rift's opening, was now bleeding resources into a containment failure around a war it had engineered. Bianzir's Hollow was the most critical system in the initial breakout because it sat closest to Sahan Sun's base of operations and acted as a forward shield for the Octos system. forces were concentrated there. Deals were struck with unlikely allies. The Aeldari, the space elves of the 40,000 setting, who have their own reasons to fear and oppose both Orks and Tyranids, deployed Asuryani and Corsair forces in support of the containment effort, detonating psychic doomsday devices at key points to stem the tide and slow the advances. Working alongside the Aeldari was not something most Deathwatch warriors found comfortable, but desperate situations strip away the comfort of principled refusals. The Pancalis breakout was eventually contained, but it was a warning that the cordon impenetra was not the airtight solution it needed to be. The war was spreading, and the longer it went on, the more both the Tyranids and the Orks improved, which meant the more dangerous any future breakout would be. A faction called the Dark Krakens deserves particular note here. These are one of the genuinely interesting new factions introduced specifically in the Warzone Octarius campaign books. Founded during the massive wave of new chapter creation that followed the return of Primarch Guilliman, drawn from Salamander's gene stock, operating out of the perpetually dark ocean world of Nactus, they have developed expertise in fighting in low-visibility conditions, underground, and in nautical engagements. There's something deeply evocative about a chapter whose Marines spend their training in pitch-black underwater environments, learning to navigate and fight by touch and sound rather than sight, and who then find themselves deployed against two of the most sensory-overwhelming combat environments imaginable: Tyranid swarms and Ork warbands. The Dark Krakens appear in Flashpoint articles and campaign material as one of the Imperium's most capable tools for the specific work the Octarius containment required, and their presence adds texture to what would otherwise be a fairly abstract strategic picture. Not far behind in narrative importance was the incident at the Maiden World of Valoria, where an inquisitor named Athocles Van Roth attempted a more proactive approach. His Deathwatch teams had recovered something remarkable, a device created by an Ork mechaniac called Badkrasha's Crown, which had been designed to disrupt Tyranid synapse signals. The concept was staggering in its implications. If you could cut individual Tyranid organisms off from the hive mind's direction, you could potentially neutralize swarms without killing every organism individually disconnected from synapse control. Many Tyranid creatures revert to feral, instinctual behavior that is dangerous but not directed, not coordinated, not strategically meaningful. It was the kind of weapon that could change the calculus of an entire war. Van Roth was not averse to using Xenos technology against Xenos enemies. He ran trial after trial on Valoria, trying to calibrate the crown. Nothing worked properly. What it may have done, instead, is attract Orks. The device's operating frequency possibly served as an Ork rallying signal rather than a Tyranid disruptor. Forces that should have been opposing each other on Valoria instead converged on Van Roth's position. The resulting disaster required a fighting retreat to an Aeldari shrine tower, a detonation to buy escape time, alliances formed in desperation with Aeldari warriors who had their own agenda, and ultimately a catastrophic failure that killed most of the Imperial forces, lost the crown entirely, and left Van Roth counting survivors and reassessing what exactly he thought he was going to achieve. Part 8. Ghazghkull arrives, the prophet of the Green Gods. If the Octarius War has a single turning point that the Ork side of history will remember forever, it is the moment when a battered Ork fleet arrived in the sector under a flag so distinctive, so immediately recognizable, that the war bosses across Octarius felt the shift in Wa energy before they even received word of who had come. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the Beast of Armageddon, the prophet of Gork and Mork, the Ork warlord who had twice brought war to the Forge world of Armageddon on a scale that required the Imperium's most desperate defensive effort. The being who, according to his own account, and the general belief of millions of Orks across the galaxy, receives direct visions from the twin Ork gods themselves. And according to those visions, he is destined to be the catalyst for the largest, most total, most reality-threatening Ork conflict in the history of the species. The story of how Ghazghkull got to Octarius begins, oddly, with boredom. He had returned to Armageddon for the third war on that planet and had been conducting operations there when he apparently decided, by his own alien reckoning, that the fight was no longer providing the spiritual sustenance it once had. Armageddon was extraordinary, but it was also familiar. Ghazghkull had fought there before. He had won before. The world bled and burned under his attentions, but a prophet of the Orc gods has horizons beyond a single world, however well named. He left. He proclaimed the beginning of a new Great Wa, a specific declaration that serves in Orc culture as something between a military call to arms and a religious event. The announcement that a warlord of sufficient spiritual authority is commencing the kind of campaign that the gods themselves sanctioned. Orcs from dozens of light years away began responding to this declaration, the gravitational pull of a sufficiently massive Wa drawing them in from the darkness of the void. Ghazghkull moved through the galaxy, fighting warbands into submission, adding their forces to his own, building momentum. A space wolf named Ragnar Blackmane would later remove Ghazghkull's head in one confrontation which was eventually resolved, after his own fashion, by the Orc Mad Doc Grotznik, providing an even larger and more impressive new body, but that is a story for another time. What matters here is that Ghazghkull turned his enormous growing armada toward the galactic southeast and the Octarius sector. He had heard about the fighting. He had felt the Wog energy building across the region like a second sun. Whatever spiritual arithmetic he was doing internally, the conclusion was clear. Where the biggest fight is, that is where a prophet of the Orc gods belongs. He arrived at Octarius at a time when the Orc forces in the sector were in somewhat fractured shape. The overfiend Gorsnik Magash, who had held the title during part of the conflict, had departed for Armageddon to join the fighting there. The Orc equivalent of being pulled away by a shiny object, except the shiny object was a galactic war. In his absence, a Deathskull warlord named Zog Steeltooth had claimed the overfiend title, but his rule was turbulent even by Orc standards. The war against the Tyranids was ongoing and intense, but the internal coherence of the Orc forces, always more coalition than unified army, had frayed. Then Ghazghkull walked in. The effect of a being with his level of Wa energy and his religious authority on an Orc population already in the grip of sustained war madness is difficult to overstate. Every Orc in the sector felt it, not as a thought or a message, but as a physical sensation, like the bass note of a sound that is more felt in the chest than heard. Something significant had arrived, something the Orc gods approved of. Ghazghkull did what Ghazghkull does. He picked a fight immediately. The specific engagement that the lore records is his confrontation with a Moloch, a massive tunneling Tyranid bioform that surfaces suddenly from beneath its prey, exploding up through the earth to devour whatever is directly above it, and then diving back underground before a response can be organized. Molochs are among the more disturbing Tyranid organisms, both because of their ambush capability and because they're simply enormous, creatures of striking and alien ugliness, all muscle and acid glands, and biomorphic killing architecture. Ghazghkull was swallowed whole. This is where the story becomes, frankly, the kind of thing that the Orcs will be telling forever. Because being swallowed by a Moloch is, for most organisms, the conclusion of the story. You are inside a creature that is designed to digest other living things. There is nowhere to go. There is no cavalry coming. The acid works fast, and yet the rally cry that went up through the Orc lines a short time after Ghazghkull disappeared was not mourning. It was recognition. Something tremendous was about to happen. Ghazghkull cut his way out. The Moloch came apart from the inside. The prophet of Gork and Mork, burning with acid damage, impaled on spines he could not immediately remove, bleeding freely, and grinning with something very close to religious satisfaction, stood up in the ruin of the creature that had tried to digest him, and issued a rallying cry that, according to accounts from Orcs who were there, physically moved the air around him. The Tyranids in the immediate area were not prepared for what happened next. A figure who had just survived being swallowed and chose violence as his response to the experience tends to make a strong impression. The Orc forces in Octarius reorganized themselves around Ghazghkull, not because he ordered them to, exactly, because the Wa field he generated was simply too strong to resist. War bosses, who had been competing with each other, found a clear hierarchy reasserting itself. The factional squabbling that had characterized the Orc response since Blacktooth's original countercharge settled not into perfect order. Orcs don't do perfect order, but into something more like a focused mob than a leaderless riot. The Tyranid push that had been gaining momentum in the central systems found, suddenly, that the Orcs were hitting back harder than before and with more coordination than a species that famously mistrusts strategy had any right to manage. The hive mind noted Ghazkol's presence with appropriate attention. In the Swarm Lord's direction of the swarm's intelligence, there's lore to suggest that Ghazkol represented a specific tactical problem that the Tyranids were recalibrating to address. A being who could survive being eaten, who could reorganize an entire sector's worth of Ork forces through sheer psychic and physical presence, who could personally account for organisms that should have killed him. This was not a standard variable in the swarm's ongoing calculations. The hive fleet began adjusting. But Ghazkol didn't stay. This is perhaps the most interesting aspect of his Octarius episode. Having arrived, having torn through the Tyranid lines, having reinvigorated the entire Ork war effort in the sector, having demonstrated definitively and in the most visceral way possible that the Orks were not going to collapse under pressure, he left. He reorganized the Greenskin forces, passed authority to whatever war boss seemed most capable of maintaining the fight's momentum, and departed with his armada toward the Imperium. The fleet he left Octarius with was a stunning figure. 5 million warships. He had arrived with a substantial force and departed with a force amplified by the Orks of Octarius, who joined his banner, drawn by his legend and the Wa energy that surrounded him. 5 million ships. To put that in perspective, the largest naval engagements in Imperial history, the battles around Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade, for instance, typically involve forces numbered in the thousands of vessels on each side. 5 million ships is not a fleet. It is a mobile civilization, a wandering nation of violence with its own ecology and economics and social structure. It is, to any species it turns its attention toward, essentially an extinction event in slow motion. Ghazkol had not finished with Octarius. He had simply moved on to the next stage of his religious calling. The war in the sector he left behind remained brutal, ongoing, and increasingly complex. Part 9. The Forge World and the Eternal Crusader. Black Templars at Sigma Ulstari. The Cordon Impenetra had already strained under the Pancalis breakout. The second major rupture came at the Sigma Ulstari system, and it demonstrated something that Imperial tacticians found deeply uncomfortable. The war was reaching outward with the inevitability of gravity, and fighting it at its borders required the same kind of resources that could otherwise be used to fight the war's underlying causes. Sigma Ulstari was important for a reason that superseded simple military value. It housed a forge world, a planet dedicated to the Adeptus Mechanicus and its industrial worship of the machine and the technology the Mechanicus maintains and produces. Forge worlds are the beating heart of the Imperium's war economy. They produce weapons, vehicles, ships, ammunition, spare parts, and the trained technicians who maintain all of the above. The loss of a forge world is not just a military setback. It is a wound to the Imperium's capacity to fight wars at all, a hole in the industrial web that takes decades of costly effort to repair. The defenders of Sigma Ulstari initially held. An Ork invasion was beaten back in the first engagement, and the garrison called for reinforcement while preparing for the next wave with grim professionalism. The next wave, when it came, was worse. Ork forces and Tyranid forces both arrived simultaneously, the two species fighting each other as they fought the planet's defenders, creating a three-way battle that no defensive doctrine in the Tactica Imperialis had a chapter on. The Forge World's massive chemical waste processing facilities, the byproduct of centuries of industrial activity, had created oceans of toxic waste on Sigma Ulstari's surface. The defenders initially found some cold comfort in the fact that Tyranid spores dropped into these toxic seas would surely be neutralized. The comfort did not last. The Tyranids adapted. By the time the second major wave of spores descended on Sigma Ulstari, the organisms they carried were simply not bothered by the toxicity of the planet's waste oceans. They had, in the span of weeks, produced an entirely new generation of organisms with carapaces and biochemistry specifically adapted to survive chemical immersion that would dissolve most organic life in minutes. The defenders, who had hoped the toxic seas would serve as a natural barrier, watched in silence as Tyranid organisms simply walked through them. The situation deteriorated further with the arrival of a particularly dangerous Ork war boss named Tuskegrob Worldkilla. Worldkilla had a plan, and while plans are not common in Ork warfare, This one was appropriately ambitious and deeply alarming. He brought 6 gigantic battering rams, each one pulled by an Orkiosaurus, a massive riding beast, roughly analogous to a living tank, covered in bolt-on armor plates and weaponry, and the shouted mechanical prayers that orc mechs offer to their machines. The rams were explosive-rigged, designed to simply crash into the Forge World's primary defensive wall at Alpha Primaros and detonate, collapsing the fortification and allowing the orc forces to flood through. Aerospace battles broke out above the industrial districts, as Aeronautica Imperialis fighters tried to hold the sky against orc fighter squadrons, while simultaneously dealing with the Tyranid flying bioforms that were also contesting the airspace. The ground situation was deteriorating faster than the defenders could respond. Imperial Guard armored columns surged forward to intercept the Orkiosaurus convoy and were losing the foot race. High Marshal Helbrecht, looking at the situation from his command position, understood that conventional interdiction was not going to stop those battering rams before they reached the wall. He noticed something. The Orkiosaurus's armored howdahs, the platforms mounted on their backs that served as mobile command posts and weapon platforms, were not shielded. Architecturally impressive, physically enormous, packed with orc warriors and weapons, but unshielded. You could board them. The Black Templars are a chapter that views boarding actions with the kind of enthusiasm that most military organizations reserve for well-planned defensive operations. The Black Templars don't particularly believe in well-planned defensive operations. They believe in getting close to the enemy as fast as possible and engaging them in the most direct way available. Boarding an Orc War Beast's command platform while it was still moving toward a heavily defended wall, under fire from multiple directions, was exactly the kind of mission their doctrine called for and their culture celebrated. Helbrecht led the boarding personally. Black Templars and Skitarii, the half-cybernetic warriors of the Adeptus Mechanicus, were loaded onto Archaeopters Mechanicus aircraft and sent racing toward the lead Orkiosaurus under orc fighter attack. Barely half the aircraft made it to their targets. That was enough. The boarding actions were chaos in the purest sense. Close-quarters combat in multi-story structures mounted on moving living platforms, under atmospheric fighter attack, against orcs, who found the situation so entertaining they were grinning even as they fought for their lives. There's something specifically unsettling about fighting an enemy who is enjoying themselves. Human soldiers in desperate last stands rely partly on the psychological pressure they put on the enemy. The determination to make taking this position cost more than it's worth. Orcs don't respond to that pressure. The closer you push them to death, the more they enjoy the pushing, which means the final stages of any fight against a large orc force are always the hardest and most expensive, because that is precisely the moment when every orc remaining is at their most motivated and performing at their biological peak. Helbrecht himself reached the lead platform. The lead platform carried World Killa. The duel between Helbrecht and World Killa became one of those engagements that gets recorded in chapter histories, not because the outcome was in doubt, it ended with World Killa dead, but because of what it cost. World Killa matched Helbrecht's strike for strike. He countered every attack the High Marshal produced, and his counterstrikes did damage. He broke Helbrecht's arm, specifically the arm that remained organic. The High Marshal had already lost and replaced other limbs with bionic components. He punched Helbrecht in the face hard enough to crack his skull and drive him to one knee. Helbrecht, kneeling, arm broken, skull cracked, looked up at an orc warboss positioning himself for the killing blow and responded with the one weapon still available to him, his combi melta, duty's burden, discharged at point-blank range into World Killa's knee. The joint exploded. The warboss dropped, and in the moment of opening created by his fall, Helbrecht drove his sword through World Killa's head. The other boarding actions succeeded as well. The remaining Orkiosauruses were brought down or diverted. The battering ram assaults stalled. The fleet that had been racing to Sigma Ulstari's salvation in Domitus Crusade Fleet Primus's Task Force 5 aboard the Retribution-class battleship Faithbringer, accompanied by the rogue trader Ava Falamor's Grand Cruiser, and most imposingly of all, the Eternal Crusader, the Black Templar's flagship and one of the most recognizable warships in Imperial service, arrived in force and broke through the orbital engagement within hours. Millions of troops, tanks, knights, and titans landed. The combined assault cleared Sigma Ulstari's surface. The Forge world was saved. But the cost was significant, and the lesson was sobering. Saving one Forge world required the intervention of a High Marshal, an Indomitus Crusade task force, and a fleet carrier of legend. The Octarius Warzone was expanding its demands on Imperial resources with every passing month. Part 10. The Swarmlord's Endgame, the Fall of Octaria. While the battles at the cordon's edges drew attention and resources, the central conflict in the Octaria system was entering its decisive phase. The Tyranids had been patient. They had been methodical. They had lost engagements, been pushed back, suffered defeats on individual worlds and in individual systems. But the hive mind does not experience defeat the way other species do. A defeat is data. A defeat is learning. And every defeat in Octarius had made the hive fleet smarter. The opening of the Great Rift, the galaxy-spanning warp tear that came with the 13th Black Crusade and Cadia's fall, disrupted both sides. Tyranid reinforcement tendrils that had been en route to the sector were lost in the new warp currents, delayed by months or years. The psychic landscape of the galaxy changed around the war, without either combatant choosing for it to do so. And through the newly torn edges of reality, something else arrived in Octarius. Khorne noticed the fighting. For the Blood God, whose divine portfolio encompasses all violent deaths across all of reality, an ongoing war between two species that kill continuously and without mercy or quarter is essentially a continuous feast. Cornate daemons, empowered by the new ease of passage across the warp's torn boundaries, poured into the Octarius sector as if summoned, accompanied by World Eater's warbands and other servants of the Blood God who had heard about the scale of the slaughter and wanted to participate. A warband specifically named the Skull Hunt of Vadha Bloodprice invaded the Octarius system and spent a full year collecting trophies from both Orks and Tyranids in what their records describe as an extraordinarily productive campaign. Their leader, Vodha Bloodprice, eventually ascended to daemonhood by slaying a Hierophant Bio-Titan, the largest class of Tyranid walking organism, using a great axe taken from a fallen Ork warboss. The chaos intrusion was brief by the standards of the war's overall duration, but its consequences were asymmetric. The demons killed Orks and Tyranids in large numbers, but only the Orks were capable of using those deaths as fuel for future strength. The Tyranids gained nothing from killing demons. They cannot consume warp-spawned organisms for biomass. The chaos entities are made of something that the Tyranid digestion system simply cannot process. When the Khornate forces finally departed or were destroyed, they had inadvertently shifted the balance. The Ork population had lost numbers, but recovered through reproduction and sheer biological resilience. The Tyranids had lost organisms and gained nothing to replace them. For a period, the Orks held the advantage. The Overfiend in power, at this stage, the previously unnamed Overfiend, who would ultimately be the one to face the Swarmlord in the final battle, pressed it aggressively. With the Tyranids temporarily weakened, the Ork advance across Octaria's surface was genuinely threatening to break the stalemate entirely. The Swarmlord, commanding what remained of the ground forces on Octaria, found itself in a fight that was going badly. The Hivemind's response was not to commit more to the fight it was losing, but to change what the fight was about. The Swarmlord pulled back from the direct engagement and directed the fleet to begin consuming the smaller Ork-held worlds surrounding Octaria. Gorola, Keltor, Daragon worlds that had been contested and fought over throughout the war were now subjected to a systematic and accelerated consumption process. The biomass from those worlds went into producing new organisms and, critically, new bioships. Thousands of them. The Great Rift's disruption had delayed these reinforcements, but they arrived eventually, sliding out of the new warp currents in numbers that transformed the orbital situation around Octaria. The Swarmlord surrounded the capital world with this new fleet, cutting off any possibility of Ork reinforcement reaching the planet from elsewhere in the sector. The orbital blockade is one of the most important and underappreciated tactical elements of the Octarius War's endgame, and it demonstrates something about the hive mind's strategic thinking that should make anyone who studies Tyranid doctrine deeply uncomfortable. It understood the war at a level that none of its Ork opponents could fully match. The Orks fought in the present tense. They responded to what was in front of them, amplified by what was loudest and most immediately violent. They did not maintain strategic communication across the system with anything like reliable consistency. The Overfiend could direct forces on Octaria, could project authority across the capital's surface, but he had limited means of coordinating with warlords on other worlds who were conducting their own fights against their own local Tyranid infestations. The Swarm Lord exploited this. By sending subfleets to harass and distract Ork warbands across the surrounding systems, it ensured that every Ork warboss within reinforcement range of Octaria was already fully occupied with his own survival. The warlords, who might otherwise have broken from their local engagements and led a relief force to Octaria, simply could not disengage. The Tyranids had them pinned not by concentrating overwhelming force on each of them, but by maintaining just enough pressure everywhere simultaneously that no one had the freedom to move. It was a multi-front strategic operation of considerable sophistication, and it was being directed by a consciousness that had spent years learning specifically how the Orks of this sector fought and what their limitations were. The Swarm Lord had paid attention. All those early defeats, all the adaptations, all the deaths and rebirths, they were a curriculum, and now it was applying what it had learned. Then it waited, and while it waited, it sent subfleets in different directions to keep every Ork warboss across the sector occupied with their own survival, ensuring no one had the freedom to detach forces toward Octaria. On the planet's surface, the siege began to tell. The Ork forces, cut off from resupply, began to run low on ammunition. The highly adapted weapons the mechs had been producing throughout the war required specific materials that were becoming scarce. Ork vehicles, maintained through constant jury-rigging and innovation throughout the conflict, began breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The Overfiend himself was not immune to the grinding cost of the siege. A Carnifex's death throes during one engagement caught him with a claw, and the injury to his leg was severe enough to limit his mobility for weeks. The Orks don't surrender. That isn't a cultural affectation or a point of honor. They biologically lack the neural architecture for the concept, but they can be reduced. They can be ground down, exhausted, deprived of what they need to sustain the momentum that makes them so dangerous, and that is precisely what the Swarm Lord's blockade accomplished. When the Swarm Lord finally returned to the surface of Octaria for the final confrontation with the Overfiend, it did so with a preparation that its previous attempt at the same goal had lacked. The first time it had challenged the Overfiend directly, earlier in the war, the Overfiend had won. He crushed the Swarm Lord's head in his power claw and tore the creature in half. The Swarm Lord was not dead. It cannot die permanently, only be temporarily ended, but the defeat had been decisive and had cost the Tyranids significantly in Octaria's broader battle. This time was different. This time, the Ork warlord was injured. His power claw, the weapon that had killed the Swarm Lord before, had a severed hydraulic cable damaged in a previous engagement, the repair parts unavailable in a siege environment where supply chains had been cut. The claw was dead weight hanging at his side, its strength hydraulics unable to function, and the Swarm Lord had fought this specific opponent before. It remembered. It knew where the Overfiend's attacks came from, what patterns he favored, where the gaps in his offense appeared. The final battle between the Swarm Lord and the Overfiend of Octarius is described in the campaign sources with the kind of sustained, granular detail that suggests the writers understood they were recording the climax of the entire war's central conflict. The Overfiend fought with everything he had. An Ork who has survived long enough to hold the title of Overfiend is not a creature who dies easily or quietly. He swung the dead weight of his claw as a bludgeon. He used his bulk, his reach, his experience, everything, decades of survival, in the most violent environment the galaxy currently offered, had given him. He hit the Swarm Lord. He hit it hard and often. He bled it. The Swarm Lord absorbed the damage and worked, patient, methodical. The Swarm Lord is not a creature that has emotions in the way we understand them, but its intelligence is real and its focus absolute. It parried. It maneuvered. It looked for the specific gap, the single opening that the Overfiend's impaired mobility and damaged weapon created. When it found it, it moved with a speed and decisiveness that only something designed as the apex of alien lethality can manage. The first hit severed the exposed hydraulic cable entirely. The claw went fully dead. The second hit the two bone blades of the Swarm Lord's primary arms. weapons of extraordinary sharpness, driven with the force of a creature, built to crack the shells of war machines, smashed open the Overfiend's skull. And then, the Swarmlord did something that was not tactical, not necessary for the kill, but deeply significant in what it communicates about the hive mind. It buried its own maw within the Overfiend's open skull and consumed his brain. The greenskin was gone, and the hive mind had eaten his mind. Whatever that means in terms of information transfer or symbolic consumption is a question the lore leaves deliberately unanswered. There are those in the Imperium's Ordo Xenos who have theorized extensively about what, if anything, the Tyranids can extract from consuming a highly developed and psychically active brain like an Ork warlord's, specifically one whose Wa energy and tactical instincts had been sharpened by years of sustained conflict against the swarm itself. If any information was transferred, if the hive mind gained even a fraction of the Overfiend's accumulated battle knowledge through that consumption, then the victory was even more complete than it appeared. The enemy's greatest general dead, and his experience fed directly into the consciousness that killed him. But even setting aside that speculation, the symbolic dimension of the act is hard to ignore. The Swarmlord chose, in the moment of final victory, not simply to kill the Overfiend, but to consume him, to erase him in the most complete way the Tyranid biology offers. In a universe full of dramatic last stands and remembered heroes, the Overfiend's end left nothing behind to remember. No body, no relic, no site of heroic death for future Orks to make pilgrimages to. Just absence. Just silence in the Wog field where his presence had burned so bright. The Overfiend of Octarius was dead in the most complete sense the setting allows for. There was no gene seed to recover. There was no successor automatically waiting. There was only the echo of his absence in the Wog energy that had built up across the sector, and that now, without its central focus, began to dissipate. Part 11. The Aftermath. What was born in the Octarius furnace? The fall of Octaria did not end the Octarius War. It would be more accurate to say that it changed it. In the weeks following the Overfiend's death, the Orks of the sector behaved exactly as Ork lore predicts they always will when a dominant leader is removed. They exploded into factional competition. No fewer than 6 warlords declared themselves the rightful successor to the Overfiend title and began gathering forces. This meant that instead of a single, if chaotic, Ork war effort, the Tyranids now faced multiple competing Ork factions who were also fighting each other, which perversely may have made the situation even more dangerous for the swarm in some ways. Killing a unified enemy requires directed effort. Killing an enemy that is fractured into competing groups requires simultaneous engagement on multiple fronts, and the Tyranids were already maintaining a wide deployment. But the hive mind's advantage was clear. The Tyranids held Octaria. They were consuming it, even as the Orks retreated and regrouped. They had the military momentum. They had the strategic position. They had, in the long view of the war's arc, won the central engagement, and were now in the process of consolidating that victory while managing the still significant Ork forces scattered across the sector. The war was not over. It may never properly end, given the nature of both species involved. Ork spores persist in the soil of every world the greenskins have ever occupied. The hive fleet, having consumed enormous quantities of Ork biomass across the years of fighting, was simply not going to leave a resource-rich region it had fought so hard to enter. But the nature of the conflict had shifted from something like a balanced stalemate to something more like a slow-motion Tyranid victory, proceeding world by world, system by system, against an Ork resistance that remained fierce but was no longer coordinated. The broader consequences are where the story becomes genuinely chilling. What came out of the Octarius furnace from the Tyranid side was something the hive mind didn't have before the war began. Years of sustained combat against Orks, the most physically robust, aggressively adaptive, biologically unusual opponent the swarm had faced in living Imperial memory, had resulted in a generation of Tyranid organisms carrying Ork genetic templates. The Tyranids that fed on Ork biomass absorbed Ork genetic material into their own pool. This is not metaphorical. This is how Tyranid evolution works. Consume, analyze, incorporate, produce. The organisms spawned by the Norn Queens during and after Octarius had access to Ork genetic advantages: durability, aggression, rapid reproduction, resistance to environmental extremes. Lore notes actually suggest that some Tyranid bioforms, the biovore is one example, specifically mentioned show genetic characteristics consistent with Ork origins. Whether that originated in Octarius or earlier conflicts is a question the lore doesn't definitively resolve, but Octarius certainly accelerated whatever process was already underway. The post-Octarius Tyranid swarm fighting in other sectors showed differences. They were faster to anger, more inclined toward direct, overwhelming assault rather than patient guerrilla tactics. They hit harder at the initial engagement point. They were, by measurable standards, more dangerous than they had been before they spent years eating orcs. From the orc side, the consequences were different but equally significant. The orcs who survived Octarius were not ordinary orcs. They had fought non-stop against the Tyranids for years, in an environment where the Tyranids were specifically evolving to counter them, where every day brought new organisms with new tactics and new physical capabilities. They had lost, they had adapted, they had developed instincts and reflexes for fighting things that no previous generation of orcs had encountered. They were bigger, having grown from continuous combat. They were angrier, having lost worlds and kin to an enemy they couldn't simply overpower in the ways that orc culture provides scripts for. And they were spreading. Orcs displaced from the Octarius sector carried their experiences and their spores with them as they scattered across the surrounding regions. New warbands formed, new conflicts ignited. The orcs who had survived the Octarius crucible became, in their scattered form, a dozen new problems for the sectors they entered. Cryptman had wanted to trap two dangerous forces inside a contained killing field. What he had also done, inadvertently, was create a training ground. The orcs that came out of Octarius were graduates of the hardest school in the galaxy. The Imperium's position in all of this is a study in the kind of grim irony that the Warhammer 40,000 setting does better than almost any other fictional universe. The Ordo Xenos was right to call the cleanup an unholy mess. The Cordon Impenetra never achieved the seamless containment it was designed to provide. Multiple systems inside the cordon that had been effectively abandoned were consumed or overrun. Systems outside the cordon that were supposed to be safe were breached multiple times through both the Pancalis and Sigma Ulstari incidents. The Deathwatch and Space Marine chapters, who operated inside and around the war zone, suffered meaningful casualties, maintaining operations that were, in the end, holding back a tide rather than stopping it. And Cryptman himself? He remained outside the official Inquisition structure for the rest of his recorded career, operating with the small cadre of loyal Deathwatch warriors who had stayed with him through the censure and the exile. History's judgment of him is genuinely complex. He saved the worlds along Leviathan's original, projected path from destruction. He bought time that the Imperium used to build defenses, to strengthen positions, to survive. Without Octarius, Hive Fleet Leviathan's course toward the galactic core might have continued unimpeded, and the consequences of that are too large to fully imagine. But he created something new and horrible in the process. He took two threats and, through his intervention, made both of them worse. He gave the Tyranids a source of orc biomass on an extraordinary scale. He gave the orcs an enemy so relentless and so perfectly matched to their biology that fighting it made them into something even more dangerous than they already were. He took a galaxy that was losing a war against the Tyranids and added a second, amplified threat to its existing burdens. Is he a hero? A villain? The 40,000 setting's most honest answer is that he is neither and both, and that the categories don't quite fit the scale at which he operated. He made a choice under impossible pressure with the information he had, and the consequences spiraled beyond any one person's ability to predict or control. In that specific sense, he is probably the most representative figure in the entire Octarius war story. Everyone who touched this conflict made choices that produced consequences they didn't anticipate. The hive mind assumed orcs could be consumed like any other species, and instead ended up in the longest sustained ground war of its invasion campaign. The orcs assumed this new enemy was just another enemy to be beaten by fighting harder, and instead found that harder fighting was exactly what made the enemy stronger. The Imperium assumed the two sides would destroy each other, and instead watched them forge each other into superior weapons. The Swarmlord itself, and this is perhaps the most haunting detail in the whole story, had its head crushed and its body torn apart by an orc in the middle of this war. The being that is arguably the apex of all Tyranid strategic intelligence, the closest thing the hive mind has to an individual general, was physically destroyed by the leader of a civilization that builds its vehicles with hammers and sheer enthusiasm. It came back. Of course it came back. That's what the Swarmlord does. But it came back having learned. It came back with the specific tactical memory of being killed by the overfiend of Octarius, embedded in whatever passes for its consciousness. And it applied those lessons until it found the moment that worked, the gap in the overfiend's defenses that his injury and the siege's attrition had finally opened. That is the Octarius War in miniature. Everyone learns, everyone adapts. The cost of the learning is measured in worlds. As a final note on the broader implications, the post-Octarius galaxy is measurably more dangerous than the pre-Octarius galaxy, and the lore acknowledges this openly. The Orc migration that Gazkul ignited using Octarius as his launching point, the 5 million ship armada that left the sector heading toward the Imperium, is still out there, somewhere, being tracked with the kind of pained attention you give to an extremely large and motivated disaster in slow motion. The Tyranid swarm that emerged from Octarius hardened and genetically enriched is now pressing against sectors that had been relatively peaceful. And in the remains of the Orc Empire, in the fractured power struggle between 6 competing warlords, all claiming the Overfiend title, there is the very real possibility that one of them will consolidate power, will gather enough Wa energy from the remaining conflict, and will emerge from Octarius as something that makes Blacktooth's original empire look like a minor regional problem. Consider the specific horror of what the Tyranids learned. They entered Octarius knowing almost nothing about how to fight an Orc opponent effectively, and within the first engagements on Orok, they were being pushed back and overrun. The hive mind adapted its ground tactics within days. Within weeks, it was fighting Orc forces more effectively than any previous engagement in that war would have suggested possible. Within months, it was producing new organisms with enhanced aggression and durability. Within years, it was coordinating at a sector level, managing the consumption of surrounding worlds while maintaining an extended siege around the capital, a level of multi-system strategic coordination that the Hive fleet had not demonstrated before Octarius in quite the same sustained way. And all of that learning is now baked into the genetic and psychic records that the hive mind carries. Every Tyranid force that fights Orcs in the future, anywhere in the galaxy, will have access to the Octarius lessons. The Orcs will never have the advantage of being unknown to the hive mind again. Not ever. Not in any conflict. What took years of brutal learning in Octarius is now simply standard operating procedure for the swarm, a genetic memory carried forward indefinitely. The Orcs, from their side, produced something that the Imperium's analysts found even more alarming in some ways: a legend. The Octarius War became the defining event in the living memory of an entire Orc generation. The boys who fought there and survived did so against an enemy that never stopped, never ran out of organisms, and kept sending new and more terrible things against them even when they thought they'd won. Surviving that makes you something different from an Orc who has only ever fought humans or Tau or other Orcs. It gives you a reference point for the absolute edge of Orc endurance, and knowing you crossed that edge and kept fighting makes you, in the peculiar psychology of Orcish culture, essentially invincible in your own estimation. These Orcs dispersed. They carried their spores and their stories and their newly won scale and hardness into every region they entered. New warbands formed around veterans of Octarius, with a reputation that drew younger Orcs the way bright light draws moths. New conflicts ignited from the meeting of those warbands with everyone they encountered. The war inside Octarius produced Orc combatants who were specifically trained by the hardest possible instruction to fight the most dangerous opponent imaginable. And then it released them into the wider galaxy. The war that was supposed to consume 2 threats and leave the Imperium safer has instead consumed dozens of worlds, hardened both surviving factions into deadlier versions of themselves, spawned a dozen downstream conflicts and migrations, and left a region of space the size of Ultramar as an ongoing, active war zone that will likely remain in crisis for generations. The Inquisitor called it a plan. History calls it the Octarius War. Future generations, if there are any in that sector, might not have words for what it was at all. But they will live with its consequences, because in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, consequences do not expire, and wars do not end cleanly. They simply transform into the next form of catastrophe, and the next, and the next, and the great machine of suffering keeps turning, as it has always turned, as it will always turn, in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war. Conclusion: the scale of what we've just witnessed. Step back for a moment and consider the full arc of what we've just walked through. An Inquisitor, stripped of his rank, operating on the edges of sanctioned authority, captures living gene-stealers with a small team of space marines and puts them on a drifting space wreck. From that single decision, made in desperation by one man in a cave on a world called Carpathia, the following chain of events occurs. A hive fleet changes course. Two of the most dangerous species in the galaxy engage in a decade-long war. Multiple Forge worlds are threatened. An Ultima founding Space Marine chapter gets its founding purpose. The greatest Ork warlord in living memory uses the conflict as a launching point for a campaign that threatens the Imperium with 5 million ships. The Swarmlord dies and is reborn and refines itself. An Overfiend dies with his brain eaten. Both species emerge more dangerous than they began. The Imperium, watching from the edges, bleeds resources, maintaining a containment that never quite holds, and counts the cost in worlds and lives and decades of military effort. All from one man and a brood of captured Genestealers on a space hulk. What the Octarius War does, that the very best Warhammer 40,000 lore always manages to do, is demonstrate the internal consistency of the universe's rules. The Orks got stronger, because that's what Orks biologically do when they fight. The Tyranids got more dangerous, because that's what Tyranids biologically do when they consume. The Imperium failed to contain it, because that's what happens when you try to manage two forces that are individually nearly unmanageable, using the limited tools of a civilization already stretched across 1 million worlds and 1,000 wars. Nothing that happened in Octarius violated the rules of how these species work. The catastrophe was not a narrative accident or an authorial cheat. It was the logical, inevitable, almost mathematical consequence of mixing two elements that each had well-understood properties. The Imperium, specifically, understood those properties, and did it anyway. That combination of inevitability and deliberate choice is what gives this story its weight. This wasn't a natural disaster. A man made a decision. The decision had consequences that cascaded across decades and light years. And the man who made the decision lived to see enough of those consequences to understand what he had done, without any obvious indication that he thought he had been wrong to do it. There is also something quietly remarkable about the way this story treats both the Orks and the Tyranids as genuine actors, rather than simply forces of nature with no internal logic. The Orks cheering as the mycetic spores fell on Octarius, the Tyranids retreating in perfect unison on Gorala and lying dormant in caves until nightfall. Scarfang pursuing the fainting swarm on the 10th repetition of a provocation that was specifically designed to make him pursue. These are not random events. They are the logical output of two sets of biology and psychology interacting in a specific environment. The story respects both sides enough to let them be themselves, fully and consistently. And the tragedy and the horror, and yes, occasionally the dark comedy of Octarius, flows entirely from that respect. The 41st millennium is full of wars that end in fire and silence, in the empty husks of consumed worlds, and the long silence of the void where voices used to be. The Octarius War is something rarer, a conflict that produced something. Both sides came out stronger, stranger, more dangerous. The galaxy, such as it is, was changed by what happened in that sector. Not in any way anyone planned, not in any way anyone wanted, but changed, genuinely and permanently, by the meeting of two forces that were each thought to be unstoppable and turned out, when pointed at each other, to be an engine for something much worse than either of them had been alone. That chain of causality, that sense that individual decisions made under pressure can detonate across entire sectors of space, is one of the things that makes Warhammer 40,000 lore so endlessly rich to explore. The Octarius War is not a story about heroes and villains in any clean sense. It is a story about the texture of a universe where everything has costs and nothing resolves neatly, and the attempt to solve one problem tends to produce three more. It is a story about two species that cannot stop fighting, and the species that tried to use that fact as a weapon and found that the weapon had no one's hand on the grip. The war goes on. Somewhere in the Ultima Segmentum, in a region of space that looks, from the outside, like a smear of static across the stars, the Orks and the Tyranids are still fighting. They will probably still be fighting after everyone alive right now is gone. The biology demands it, the hunger demands it. And in the quiet halls of the Inquisition, in the careful records kept by the Ordo Xenos, there is a notation against the Octarius files that has not changed in years, and likely will not change in the years to come. Ongoing. Status unresolved. Threat uncontained. Which is another way of saying exactly what Inquisitor Kryptman produced, something neither of them expected, that neither side has finished with, and that the rest of the galaxy gets to worry about indefinitely. That is the Octarius War, and it is far from over. If you made it this far, genuinely, thank you. This story is one of my favorites in all of 40K lore, because it manages to be about strategy and biology and war and the unintended consequences of desperate choices, all at the same time, all in a setting that makes the scale feel real. It is also one of those stories where the more you know about the individual pieces, the way orc biology works, the specific horror of how Tyranid evolution functions, the institutional pressures that shaped Kryptman and Sahansun, and every other human figure in this story, the richer and darker the whole thing becomes. You can encounter Octarius as a footnote, and it sounds interesting. You can encounter it the way we've gone through it today, and it sounds like the kind of thing that keeps you awake at night, wondering what else the hive mind is learning right now, in which other corners of the galaxy, against which other opponents. If you learned something new today, or if you just enjoyed spending time in this universe, drop it a like. It genuinely helps more than you might think. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, covering the conflicts and characters and factions that make the grim darkness of the far future endlessly fascinating. There is a lot more to cover. There are wars and characters and moments of lore that deserve exactly this kind of treatment, and they're coming. The 41st millennium doesn't sleep, and neither does this channel. See you in the next one.